Today I want to talk about our local ecology a little bit because we live here, but also because our research species, the spotted salamander, lives here. The spotted salamander is also known as the Ambystoma maculatum, or Ambystoma maculatum. That's its scientific name. And so we're going to be looking more at their habitat later on in our field trips, but just like us, the Ambystoma maculatum operates in or occupies a temperate deciduous forest, and so that means that we generally have a moderate climate compared to other parts of the world. We have soil that can support a diverse amount of vegetation. Most of the trees in the area are deciduous, meaning they lose their leaves during the year. So that would be like your oaks, your maples, but we do have some mixed forest in Virginia, and so that also means we have evergreens and things like that. Our diverse vegetation, of course, then comes with a diverse amount of animal species as well, especially insects and amphibians and birds and many small mammals. Because we live so close to the coast and because we're studying an aquatic or partially aquatic species this year, an amphibian, I want you to think about the importance of water to both our state and our world, because the water cycle is very much a global cycle. And so when you're looking at the ocean, light has to penetrate into the water in order for photosynthesis to occur in marine plants. So this happens in a zone called the photic zone, and that can extend about 200 meters down below the surface of the water. And you're also going to find a lot of oxygen, either from diffusion into the water or production by those photosynthesizers. Nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen are also needed by aquatic organisms, and so these mainly run off from the land, and then they go into streams and rivers and out into the ocean, and they disperse throughout the biotic organisms in the ocean. Carbon is getting fixed into carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids by the photosynthesizers, and then moves through the food chain in the aquatic food webs. So now your organisms have phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon, all starting with the producers and moving through the food web. But when they die, a lot of their tissues aren't going to get decomposed in the upper levels of the ocean where they might be living. They're going to sink down to the bottom, forming a nutrient-rich layer deep in the ocean. And so ocean currents, thankfully, create something called upwelling, where the nutrients from the bottom are transferred to those upper levels into the photic zone, and then wind currents along the top can also move them as well. And so that is now a hot zone, what we call a hot zone for fish. It's got sunlight, it has plenty of energy, it has plenty of nutrients, and so this is a very rich, diverse area, or at least it can be. And then as you start to go deeper into the ocean, you see varying amounts of nutrients and sunlight availability. And so we've actually given all those different zones that are created their names to describe them, but that's beyond our course. So if you're interested, feel free to look those up, because the ocean does have zone names. Decaying aquatic organisms and the nutrients that they carry with them also build up on the bottom of freshwater lakes. So in the summer, water is warmed by the sun and it becomes less dense, and so the nutrients stay in the heavier water that's on the lake bottom. But in the spring and fall, the water temperatures become consistent throughout the lake, and so that allows a process called turnover to occur, where the nutrients can spread and mix throughout the lake when it is an even temperature. And so that provides key nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen to the producers that are going to stay mainly, again, in the upper parts of the lake where light can penetrate. We categorize lakes based on their relative nutrient availability. So higher nutrients generally means higher biomass, and that tends to mean more cloudiness from all the organisms in the water. So these are the ratings: oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic. So in terms of nutrients, you're going to see the lowest nutrients in the oligotrophic and the highest in the eutrophic. Same goes for productivity. So higher the productivity, the higher the biomass. And I was just talking about biomass. The higher the biomass, the cloudier the water. So clarity is actually higher in oligotrophic lakes, whereas it's lower in eutrophic lakes. This process, moving from oligotrophic to mesotrophic to eutrophic, because it is a spectrum, it does represent a spectrum, natural succession can actually turn a lake from oligotrophic to eutrophic. But that takes centuries without human interaction or inputs into the streams and the rivers, but it can only take, 10, 20, 30 years when humans are inputting nitrogen and phosphorus into our watersheds. So this picture represents all the various inputs that can add nitrogen and or phosphorus into streams and rivers and eventually into our lakes and oceans. And so here are the two big ones, the fertilizer runoff and the sewage. But you can see that there's all kinds of other, there's a sewage. I didn't circle detergents. So here's a picture representing all of the various inputs that add nitrogen and phosphates to our streams and rivers and our lakes and oceans. The two big ones are the fertilizer runoff and the sewage runoff, but you can also have acid rain and oxides, nitrous oxides that have been added into the air and then come back down as rain. You've got erosion and all kinds of street pollutants, manure. All of those things add artificial amounts of nitrogen and phosphate, and much larger than natural runoff would add to our streams and rivers and lakes. Eutrophication is a real problem because algal blooms block the sunlight, preventing oxygen production by the producers below. And so here's an algae bloom. When those algal blooms die out, they sink to the bottom, and the decomposers working on breaking them down consume so much oxygen that larger animal species really struggle to survive. And so their option is kind of to immigrate or die, locally die out. The perfect example of this, when I think about algae blooms and eutrophication, I actually don't think about lakes. I think about the Gulf of Mexico, because it draws, you can see that Mississippi River watershed is massive, and so there's so much runoff, there's so much of our agricultural land along those states and along those rivers. And so you can see that we're measuring here extremely hypoxic conditions. So hypoxia is talking about low oxygen, very low oxygen available to those fish, and it's destroying any kind of fishing culture that would be going on in those states. The last thing I want to talk about are riparian areas. Our research is actually done in a vernal pool that has some specific ecology principles we'll talk about later, but the other IBETs study stream health, and water health generally relies on these riparian buffer areas. They filter out sediment and pollutants. They provide habitat to species in the area, and they keep the edges of the stream bed from eroding into the stream. So you can see in this picture that these are shrubby, natural areas growing right along the stream bed, and sometimes they even grow tall enough to shade the stream and provide some temperature moderation, which is really great for your aquatic animals. And so the last thing I've got for you is a picture of a desert riparian area, because again, that's where a lot of my ecology background is in the desert, not so much in our deciduous forest. But still, same principle applies. You can see that there is so much, vegetation and grasses and roots there that could trap anything, because Deserts get monsoon-like rains, but it can trap all those particulates that are going to be running off and, give bacteria time to break down some of the nitrates and phosphates before they reach the water and trap a lot of that sediment before it really clouds this stream. So that's it for today.